What's up YouTube, Dale here from Zephyr, and today we are going to discuss the top 10 decks for the upcoming format. Now the ban list has dropped. That's right, the ban list kind of left a little bit to be desired, but it did discard the most important card around, and that was of course Kashtira Rise Heart, which did make Kashtiras be highly competitive, but also kind of held back some of the other decks as well. So with all of that out of the way, please smash that like button, hit that notification bell and subscribe so you don't miss out on any more upcoming content. So I'm going to start off, we're going to go from 10 to 1 as you would usually expect. I was going to do a tier list, but I think everyone is going to be doing those. And what I do like about the format is how varied it is. There are a lot of decks that can still compete, there's a lot of road decks, and there is a lot to kind of look forward to in this upcoming format. So starting off at number 10, and again, the lower end of this list is always again down to personal preference because these usually come from the 1.5 tier list, if you consider them that way. Now, I would love to really put down Dark Worlds for sure. However, when you do need to consider Dark Worlds, they do still have a massive weakness in the form of D-Shifter still being around, and of course Droll and Lotbird. So that will be one of the honourable mentions. But in number 10, we are going to go with Mannadiums. Now the reason I've put Mannadiums in at the number 10 spot is we still have the Calamity turn skip play, which is still very well doable, and the deck can play under Nibiru. It has great resource management, and it also has a lot to be able to extend further forward, even off of just one little card here or there. They've got so many different accesses to all of the field spells within the Visas lore, and then they've got access to counter tracks to protect from stuff like Dark Rulers. They've got the ability to turn skip in the form of Calamity. They've also then got the ability to protect with stuff like Baron and Dispatter as well. Moving swiftly into number 9. Now again, like I said, these all come down to personal preference, but I've chose to go with Sunavalon Rika, or Rika Sunavalon. Now this deck is also quite budget to pick up, which is really nice because it's had a lot of reprints, and it does require you to be a fairly competent pilot in regards to the deck and learn it inside and out. Now the reason I've put Rika into this list is again just through personal playstyle and the way that I've played it, and then also being able to see people have such success with it. It's one of them decks that really does go under the radar, but it can do incredible things. You take Jess, for example, she managed to get all the way to Worlds with it, and then you also look at the other teams from the Disciples. A lot of those have been playing Rika, and they do catch a lot of people off guard. And the best thing about that is it can deal with the higher end decks, stuff like Unchained, Labrynth, and of course Tearlaments without triggering their secondary effects, which is what makes those decks so powerful and consistent. Moving into number 8. Now number 8, I'm going with Vanquish Souls. Now arguably Vanquish Souls you could push a little bit further up the list if you wanted to, but I still feel that it has the same fragilities that it had prior to the list, and not really a lot has changed. It just means that it doesn't play the Rise Heart play, which ultimately wasn't that big of an issue. And then when you're looking at the two versions right now, you've got the Synchro version using Rev Synchrons, and then using Power Tool Dragon, and then you've just got the pure hand trap version, which to me I think is definitely better. But I feel right now, because the hand trap selection is relatively limited in what it can then add to the deck itself. So for example, Ghost Bell and then of course Ash Blossom are great for the deck, but Droll and Lotbird doesn't share an attribute with the rest of the deck to make it as an integral and an effective part of the deck, but still does incredibly well. It's definitely worth giving a mention to. On top of that as well, the fact that they have the ability to maintain their own resource, they've got that ability to search out a consistent Book of Eclipse, ways of being able to revive from the graveyard, pop effects, burn effects, draw effects, you name it, this deck has got it. It's just one of the ones that I feel when you compare it to the other 7 decks on the list, depending on the pilot and the way the deck shifts out, it can really struggle. But I do think that this deck is definitely going to be one that is going to be highly represented going forward. We've already seen that it can do well under a restricted list in Worlds, but it can also do incredibly well at environments, and because there are so many different variants, you can never know exactly what's going to turn up or what you're going to face, even if you know Vanquish Souls are in attendance. So moving on to number 7, of course, we are going to be talking about Branded. Now, you can consider this to be Branded Chimera, or you can consider Chimera on its own. You can do this as Branded with the Bestial Engine, with Gimmick Puppet Lock, everything else like that. Now, the reason that the Brandeds aren't higher up this list, in my opinion, is because the deck is just generally quite fair. Now, what I mean by that is the fact that the Branded Fusion is its strongest card, but it's also its weakest card in the sense that if it does get stopped, they do have very little ways of expanding a little bit further. Yes, of course, you can main deck stuff like Super Poly. You do, of course, have Quem. You also have Cartesia that can help you extend your plays that bit further. Not everyone is main decking the Gimmick Puppet Lock, which probably has the same strength as the Calamity Lock, but the difference is Calamity goes in your extra deck, so it's a lot less in the way as a brick, and then Gimmick Puppet goes in the main deck. So obviously there's pros and cons to everything around that. And on top of that, the one big card you've got to consider that is now going to come back into the format as opposed to what it was under Cash Tierras is of course going to be Forbidden Droplet. So that's a deck that Brandy can abuse to its max potential because it doesn't mind sending some cards to the graveyard and actually gaining some advantage off it if it wanted to, but it also has so many different targets that will allow you to kind of negate the board off and then continue to push through. So it has a nice balance of going first and second, but like I said, there's very few versions of the deck that can really stop Ash Blossom. A lot of versions really tend to go through Nadir's Servant or the Chimera plays to try and push through an Ash Blossom rather than trying to change up their strategy and play cross out instead. Moving on to number 6. So number 6, I've gone with Rescue Ace. Now the reason I've gone with Rescue Ace and it's just outside the top 5 is for the pure fact that it's still a little bit untested. Like, it's had a decent time, but coming into this new format without Rise Heart around, it doesn't need to worry about all of its spells and traps getting banished. And the best thing, or the reason you want to keep some of your spells and traps in the graveyard, is that they all have secondary effects in order to banish them to gain back some resource, which is what makes the deck really good. I feel that it does have its same fragilities. If you can stop its access to Fire Hydrant, a lot of the cards do crumble a little bit. If you can stop its Turbulence, that does cause them a couple of issues as well. And then they do eventually in the grind game need to get to the field spell in order to recycle their spells and traps. And if you stop the access to the field spell or get rid of the field spell completely, they are going to struggle in order to maintain that resource. That being said, the fact that it's got such a variety coming out of its extra deck, whether you want to go for the control play, which allows you to go through some Cyverse Link plays, or if you wanted to go for a Super Poly route, it really does give you that nice little option to balance their control state and their front row board. Turbulence being a 3k is incredibly good, and then their additions, being able to book a moon monsters and everything else, can be very effective and can be very disruptive during your opponent's turn, or just being able to build up your board with stronger monsters in order to push for an OTK play as well. Moving into the top 5, hitting in at number 5, I've gone with Runick variants. Now, probably the strongest one of all of these, in my opinion, is Runick Sprite, and the fact that they kind of skated through the ban list relatively untouched is actually insanely powerful for them. The fact that the Runicks has just had a reprint does make it relatively cheaper, but we haven't seen any Sprite reprints. You can definitely contend that the Sprite level or the Sprite cost is going to go up, while the Runick one has dipped a little bit. That being said, the fact that it's more accessible to more people is going to be very good, because it means there's going to be higher representation at events as well. You've also got to consider that you do have, of course, Sprite Live Twins. You've got Runick Fur Hire, so if you want to draw like 6 or 7, I believe they end up going through. Absolutely insane. You've got funner versions of the deck where you're going to be playing generators, so it does give it back to its original lore kind of stance. I think that the Runick element being reprinted is really good. It allows you to have that budget access to it as well, but I do feel that the deck is still incredibly powerful. Like, there's no need to be running away from it. The only issue is the deck that is at the top of the list or towards the top of this list is a direct counter to it, and that's kind of what keeps it out of going any closer, because I do feel at higher competitive events you're probably only going to really see the top 3 decks on this list in and around that top section, with maybe the odd 1 or 2 rogue deck that has kind of found its way in. The issue is if it faces up against those top meta decks, they do have direct normal outs to all of them, and that's what makes them as incredibly powerful as they are. So moving into number 4, now number 4 is one that has pretty much just rocketed back up the list because not of what it's gained from the ban list, but what others have lost, and that is of course Tearlaments. Now one of the biggest things of Tearlaments that was being held back is the fact that they needed to deal with Rise Heart, which is out and out stopping them, and then they had direct access, or they had to deal with Magnamoots and of course the whole Bestial engine. Now the Bestial engine has taken a massive consistency hit, with Magnamoot going down to 1, meaning that it just gives you less access to everything else. Yes, of course, maybe you might increase your count of Druid Swarms or Saronniers in the place of the Magnamoots, but the idea was that Magnamoot would then search you out the next piece for the next play, so you wanted to be playing that at max potential, whereas now you are restricted to playing it at 1. Which does mean that Tearlaments have pretty much a free reign. We saw how popular it was during the World's Tournament. Now obviously I know that it's a different ban list, so you can't always use that directly, but we've already started to see that Tearlaments prior to the Cash Tierra hit has been doing incredibly well at summer regionals. There's a lot of different profiles online that have been getting top 8s at UK regionals, and they've definitely been competing at American regionals as well. So I highly expect Tearlaments to be coming back into the fold. And the best thing about this is when you compare it to the other decks below it and the decks above it, you can understand why it sits in the 4th spot, because I do feel that once it gets going, it really does come down to a bit of a luck basis. But if luck is on that Tearlaments player's side, there is no doubt that they will be able to run away with certain matchups, and it's absolutely insane with all the access they have. Moving into the top 3. Now, these are the 3 decks that I expect to be taking most of the tops, if not being the highest represented at all of the upcoming YCSs. I believe at the day of recording this event, there is YCS Cancun going on. We do have YCS Dortmund coming up for the European areas shortly as well. And all of this is way before we get any new cards injected into the game as well. I believe the next new lot of cards we're going to be getting injected into the game isn't going to be coming until at least November, December time. Or I believe it maybe just be October, which is Age of Overlord. And even then, the Age of Overlord only boosts up the Labrynth because we get the Butler, and it will also improve the Vanquish Soul strategy as well. It probably wouldn't shift them too much on the list, but it just makes the stronger decks on this list already a little bit stronger and more consistent as it is. So in third place, of course, we are going with Purrely. Now, arguably, Purrely could go for the second, but I do feel that the 2 decks I've put above these are definitely just more consistent, and they have natural outs to Purrely, which what makes them so much better in that kind of head-to-head matchup. But take nothing away from Purrely, they are still incredibly strong. They've had no additional hits or changes on this current list. They are still incredibly strong, very, very consistent, and they just have great ways of being able to push for OTKs, set up an insanely powerful towers, which is why a lot of people are now playing Underworld of the Goddess to deal with said towers. And the fact that the deck that is at the top of this list has a natural out to it, which is a nice little loophole that has been introduced or recently discovered in the from like other YCS events. Whether it's 100% true or not, I'm not entirely sure, but I found it fascinating the way the kind of card text worked, and it was allowed, so we're going to go with it in that one. Moving into number 2. Now, this deck could very easily be number 1, but the reason I put it at 2 and not 1 is the pure fact that I feel that number 1 just has a much better and a more consistent way to out its predecessors on this list. And number 2 is, of course, Labrynth. Now, Labrynth does have a massive thing going for it, is the fact that it technically was relatively budget. Like, Big Welcome Labrynth was sitting at like £4. I know, believe it or not. It was like £4 to £5 prior to the reprints. Reprints happened. It then went up to £10 to £15 a copy, and now it's sitting at like £20 to £25 a copy because the deck got untouched. And when we say the deck got untouched, it means Eradicator is still at free. This deck can search, set, and play Eradicator, and when it gets the Butler in Age of Overlord, it's going to be able to do that technically in turn 0, which is absolutely insanely powerful. Now, obviously, Labrynth does have a downflaw that it is a control deck. It does kind of really want to go first, and if you're able to kind of stop them building up their resource, you're in a great position. However, if the deck does get going and it can maintain its resource, build its resource, you know 9 times out of 10 when it flips that Eradicator on all of the decks below it on this list and they rip out all of their spells or all of their traps for at least 3 turns, it's going to cause a lot of issues for those decks, and it's very difficult for them decks to kind of come back into the game, especially when the Labrynths are constantly then regaining their own resource, setting up Lady Labrynth, taking cards from your hand or field. It is just insanely powerful and does cause them huge amounts of issues, and that's why Labrynth is such a good deck. And I'm slightly surprised that Eradicator managed to get past the list, but because it did, you do need to be highly considering it at one of the highest contenders for the list. So moving into number 1, what goes above Purrely, what goes above Labrynth? Well, in my opinion, the deck that does that is, of course, Unchained. Now, Unchained is definitely coming off of its most successful run right now. The new support for the deck is absolutely incredible, and Jesse Cotton took it all the way to YCS victory. I do highly expect this deck to be very well represented. There are loads of profiles popping up online, getting top cuts at YCSs, getting top cuts at regionals. It is insanely powerful. And what it does have is it does have natural outs to some of the lower decks direct out. So when you look at stuff like Eradicator, when Eradicator is destroying your spells and traps, that doesn't really make much of a difference to the Unchained strategy, because being able to destroy their own spells and traps is going to give them still some board advantage, and that board advantage can continue to kind of link with your opponent's monsters, push for an OTK, or they just set up Abomination and pick away your back row during the end phase, and then also pick away some of your monsters. Now, the one thing that this has against Purrely, which I'm not in 100% entirely true because I only heard of one occurrence about it, but the argument was that with the Unchained Soul of Rage, which is the link 2, you could actually link off with a Purrely Noir, which is unaffected, for the pure fact that the activation of the Rage is to target as the cost, and then the link is resolution. It's not an activated effect, which is a really weird kind of concept, and my understanding was exactly that. Target is cost, not activated effect, and the link is a resolution of the effect, quite like Mirror Jade, rather than an activated effect, which is why it kind of bypasses that little loophole. Double check with your head judges, but that's what I've kind of understood it to be, and that's what it was kind of ruled at one of the previous YCSs. I believe it was like Sao Paulo or one of those around that time. Regardless of that, I still feel the Unchained are incredibly powerful. Their ability to be looped around, maintain their own resource, they don't really care about destruction, being able to use opponents' monsters as link materials, and then you start adding into everything else you want to. It has so much space to place so many hand traps of the format. It can then also utilize some stronger trap cards if it needs to. It can also utilize more consistent spells, and you can already see with the rise in price for the Unchained deck how it's definitely making waves in the format. Now, arguably, some people might say that Labrynth is a little bit more familiar, and so is Purrely, which does give it a bit of an edge, and it should be more consistently as the top two. But then what you do need to take into account is some of the Unchained matchups are still a little bit fresh and a little bit new to the format. So having that unknown event, or that unknown kind of how's the best way to interact with it, how's the best way to play it, will definitely give it some wins as well. And with the right pilot, you can definitely see that the top 3 decks will be taking up most of the events. So that is it for the top 10 list. Obviously, I do believe that a lot of people are going to be having their own different variants of the list. So by all means, please put it in the comments down below what your top 10 is, or even just your top 3. If it does vary from the 3 that I've chosen, try and keep biased out of it. That's what I've tried to do. Otherwise, I would have been putting Dark Magician at number 1, because, you know, we know Dark Magician is best deck. But that is just personal preference. Looking at this list, I've kind of looked at the decks that I can do, I see can do very, very well. I feel Salamangreat could definitely be a deck that will be rogue contender on this one, but I also feel that it still has the same fragilities of stuff like Nibiru, which is why Heroes is also a very cool rogue contender, because you can go Dark Lore, and then that can really cause the Tearlaments strategy a bit of an issue, but I feel the rest of the decks don't really worry about that. I feel Go Second Scareclaw is a great option. We've also got to remember that Sword Soul have gone untouched with the right pilot in the right format. Sword Soul can still do incredibly well. We've got Adventure Synchron. There's just so much that feel outside this top 10, and that's where the tier lists come in, just to kind of give you the rankings of where that personal opinion is for what those decks kind of stand. But I thought it'd be good to give you a breakdown of my personal top 10 of what I feel is technically going to be the highest represented, the most competitive decks for this upcoming format as well. If you did like this video and you want to see a budget version of this, where I'll talk about all of the budget decks that you can pick up that will still be able to compete at a max level, then let me know in the comments below and get the video above 50 likes, and I will be more than happy to bring that for you. But for now, as absolutely always, stay safe, and of course, happy dueling.